The Poor Friar and the Boy. The Marian Imperium. A short story by Richard Warren. The boy ran after the old friar. Despite being a fifth of the monk's age, Alistair struggled to keep up. It wasn't the dilapidated stairs, though they weren't helping. It was his own girth that weighed him down. "Come along now," Father Zosim called back to him. "It isn't the road to Damascus, young man, only the Apostolica." Reaching the top stair at last, Alistair paused to catch his breath. Father Zosim smiled back at him kindly, already halfway across the chapel. Fluttering above the friar's tonsured head, beneath the ruined painting of the two men touching hands, was a flotilla of pigeons. The birds were already in position. He hadn't even set foot in the chapel, negotiated the first of its rainpools or rotting timbers, and their full firepower was already trained upon him. Last time they'd scored a direct hit. "Why do the friars leave it like this, Father?" Alistair asked, trying not to look at the pigeon bobbing on the splintered rafter above. Larger than its mates, it was the centurion in their vanguard. It cooed violently. "The Poor Friars are so named for a reason, Alistair," Father Zosim replied patiently, as if he weren't answering the same question Alistair had asked every evening for the last 8 years. "Yes, but they might at least give you something for it," Alistair said, stumbling over a shard of marble. He felt slightly queasy. Perhaps he oughtn't to have taken that extra portion of turnip soup at dinner after all. "You know very well that is their law," Father Zosim replied. "Render unto Caesar what is due to Caesar." He waited by the door in the far wall, beneath the faded painting of the end of the world. "Yes, but there's nothing to stop the Marians helping you out a bit, is there?" Alistair said, glancing nervously at the rafters. "I mean, they don't actually have to give you any gold. They could just help clear up a bit. All the Marians here are young. It wouldn't take them very long, would it?" A puddle splashed nearby as the pigeon rearguard discharged their cannon. Alistair started, hopping across the last pond to Father Zosim's side. "As I have explained to you before, young man, it is not about gold," Father Zosim replied. "The Marians do not share our beliefs. That is why they do not help us rebuild our churches." The monk was already in the stone corridor beyond. Alistair traipsed after him down the dim passageway, which was unlit save for a single torch burning at its end. His large feet slapped clumsily against the damp stones. It wasn't that the way was unknown to him. He'd been coming here for years now. It was his own body that was no longer familiar, since his limbs had unexpectedly sprouted in all directions, like the ivy in the reservation's unkept gardens. He still hadn't gotten used to it. They were nearly outside Father Zosim's chamber when a second light flashed at the opposite end of the corridor. Unlike the torch, its glimmer was steady, an unwavering red light whose glow did not warm but chilled the blood. "Hora duodecima, 12th hour," a cold voice echoed off the walls. "Curfew." The scarlet light was an electrobaton. A black beret appeared beside Father Zosim's door. Beneath it was the olive face of a young woman. The rest of her body was entirely sheathed in black leather. Her hand hovered beside the baton at her belt as she examined the friar and boy's cassocks with suspicion. Alistair hadn't seen this one before, but if he'd learned one thing in the 8 years he'd lived in the reservation, it was that it was unwise to cross a Marian. "Yes, Legionnaire, we were just returning from the refectory," Father Zosim said, returning her non-existent smile. His pale hands moved to the brass bolt on the oak door. "I was not aware that the orphan resided in the Apostolica Palace," the Legionnaire replied, her face impassive. "To my knowledge, that permission has only been granted to Bishop Virgilius and yourself. All other members of your community must remain within the dormitory after sundown." Her Latin had a slight italic lilt, and she had dark hair and eyes. She must have been from the near vicinity of the reservation. Most Marians were, though occasionally some had fair hair, pasty skin, and long legs like him. Those ones came from further away, maybe even where he'd come from. He wasn't sure exactly where that was. other than that it was very far away and much colder than the reservation. By special dispensation granted to the bishop, in light of his youth, the child Alistair is permitted to attend evening instruction under my supervision for the purposes of his education, Father Zosim said. Child, the legionnaire said, surveying Alistair's large flabby limbs. The orphan does not look like a child to me. She frowned. He is 15 years of age, legionnaire, Father Zosim said, still smiling. I assure you I shan't detain him longer than is required. The soldier did not move. She evidently had no intention of leaving the spot until Alistair's Latin lesson was over. On most evenings, he scuttled back through the Basilica Piazza to the dormitory on his own, but this Marian was clearly one of the serious ones. As Alistair followed Father Zosim inside, she raised her wrist to her mouth, muttering something about the location of heretics. He didn't know whom she meant, but it wasn't that interested him. It was the holowatch on her arm, over whose surface neon numerals danced to the rhythm of her speech, like fireflies. He would never have one, of course. All techne was forbidden the Poor Friars, but no one said you couldn't imagine it. Religio, Father Zosim began, before the door had even closed. Can you tell me the meaning of this word, Alistair? Faith, Alistair said automatically, his eyes still on the door. The old wooden chair creaked as he sat down. That had never used to happen. As everything else in Father Zosim's tiny cell, it had shrunk over the last year. No, Alistair, Father Zosim said, following the direction of his gaze. For that we have the Latin fides. Have another go. Yes, but that's what people mean by religio, isn't it? Alistair protested. He cast around the bookcases lining the stone walls, hoping for a clue. As usual, the friar had seen straight through his ruse. He faced the shield wall of tomes, the lettering of whose ancient spines was as impenetrable as the monk's question. Increasingly desperate, he peered at the icon of the mother above the stove, then at those of the bearded saints, but all were equally merciless. Religio is an enthusiasm, Alistair, Father Zosim said at last. It is true that faith is sometimes considered a kind of enthusiasm, one of a spiritual nature, but the word has a broader meaning than just that alone. He sat on the other side of the little table, dragging a large book across the oak board towards him. On its frontispiece were the words, Origen contra Celsum. Alistair grew desperate. He was sure they'd finished that one last week. Were they really going back to it again? It was awful. Another bore writing about things nobody cared about anymore, if they ever had. He must escape somehow. But they're just the same thing, aren't they? Religion and faith, Alistair said. Are they indeed? Father Zosim asked, folding his hands. To Alistair's relief, the friar let go of the book. There was hope yet. If he could just stall long enough, maybe the Marian would return and enforce the curfew. Then he could flee Origin, back to the safety of his hut in the monk's dormitory. Well, I can't see any difference, Alistair said, eyeing the book nervously. I mean, religion or faith, the only thing anyone seems to care about here is praying. His words were running away with themselves. Usually when that happened, it ended in a lecture, but surely anything was better than trundling through the mire of Origen and his rebuttal of Celsus the pagan again. So is it your belief, then, that the only enthusiasms people can enjoy are those of a spiritual nature? Father Zosim asked patiently. I must say that is certainly a very noble conviction, even if it isn't one that accords with my own experience. No, I didn't mean that it was impossible for people to be interested in other things, only that it seems the only thing anyone does around here is pray, Alistair said, fidgeting with the spine of the book. Avoiding the friar's gaze, he glanced at the icon of the mother again. It was the one with the 7 swords pointing at her heart. You live here too, do you not? Father Zosim asked, following his gaze to the small painting above the stove. Yes, I do. I mean, I know I'm not a friar like you are, but I still live here, Alistair replied. And is your only enthusiasm for prayer, Alistair? Father Zosim asked. No, I suppose it isn't, Alistair stammered. I mean, it's not that I don't like praying, it's just that... He trailed off. Father Zosim's eyebrow had risen. The old Novgorovian didn't need to say anything for Alistair to know what he meant. At dinner in the refectory that evening, he'd landed next to the oldest of the Poor Friars. It was the third time that week. It was no accident, and Father Zosim knew it. The friar in question always slept through his dinner and barely ever ate anything at all. For the third time that week, Father Zosim, who never missed a trick, had caught Alistair in the act as he helped himself to his neighbour's dinner. "Well, yes, I suppose there are other things I care about," he muttered sullenly. "Well then, there is at least one soul inside the walls of the reservation whose religio is not limited to faith alone," Father Zosim said with a smile. He reached for the book. But food isn't truly a sin, is it?" Alistair said, with mounting desperation. "Or if it is, it's not really that bad, is it? I mean, not like the other ones." His eyes flitted back to the icon with the 7 swords. Father Zosim laid the book aside. "Yes, Alistair, gluttony is a sin," he said patiently, as if he weren't repeating the same thing he'd said 100 times before. "But it's not as bad as the other 6, is it?" Alistair persisted, nodding at the icon. "The mother isn't going to die from food, is she?" "We all have our peculiar failings," Father Zosim said. "It is what makes us human. But what matters is not that we have such failings, only that we reflect upon them. For knowing them is the first step to transcending them. Our Lady of the 7 Sorrows prompts us to that reflection." "But it doesn't make any sense," Alistair said, pursuing the same argument he had ever since he'd first learned what the reservation was. "I mean, maybe it makes sense for you, but aren't you just trapped here because they put you here? And isn't that the very reason they did? And why they keep you in poverty? Because they have a different religion? I mean, faith? About her? To what you do?" For some time, Father Zosim did not answer, but only contemplated his folded hands. It wasn't the first time Alistair had asked why the Marians kept them there. Why it was that the Poor Friars had to live in shacks among ancient ruins, forbidden from straying beyond the Pomerium, the boundary of the old city. He already knew the answer, but he always asked anyway. Maybe it was because, though Father Zosim never failed to respond, there was always one part he left out. Why it was that Alistair had to stay there too, even though he wasn't a friar. Because faith, like religio, also takes many forms, Father Zosim said slowly, and sometimes people believe different things. "Yes, but why does that give them the right to lock you up like this?" Alistair protested. "The mother is still the mother, isn't she?" "She is different for them, Alistair," Father Zosim replied. "They believe that she is the supreme being, a mother goddess, one they call the Immaculate Virgin." "But don't you call her that too?" Alistair said. "Yes, but we mean something different," Father Zosim said. "When we say that the Virgin was immaculate, we mean that she birthed our Saviour free from sin." "But isn't that what they mean too?" Alistair asked. "No, Alistair," Father Zosim said. "They believe that she is the first being, Thea, who created the heavens and earth and ordered them according to the principle of the feminine. That is why they consider the Saviour, who was a man and whose teachings we follow, to have been a false prophet." Despite himself, Alistair still fidgeted with the book. By now, he'd completely forgotten about Origin. It was true that he'd often been unhappy in the reservation and didn't know why he had to stay there, but for all their failings, the friars were honest and kind people. He could barely recall anything of the world outside. He'd only been a young child when he first arrived. There was one thing he knew for sure, though. The outsiders weren't kind like the friars were. If they had been, they'd never have locked them up there just because they believed something different. "But I still don't understand why that means they get to keep you here like this," Alistair said. "Might is never right, Alistair," Father Zosim said sadly. "But in this world, we may be forgiven for sometimes believing that it is." "So we're really prisoners here, aren't we?" Alistair said, repeating his usual refrain. For the first 5 years he'd lived in the reservation, the ancient ruins of the Apostolica, Basilica, and the Forum of the Old Patriarchs had been his childhood playground. Bounding through the cabbage patches, orchards, and overgrown banks of the Tiber like a meadow hare, the old city had seemed so large, a kingdom all his own. Then, one hot afternoon 3 years ago, he'd strayed too far and gotten lost. That was the only time he'd glimpsed the pomerium, the giant electrified wall of adamantine steel that encircled the entire reservation. Scruffing him by the collar, a Marian had marched him straight to the Apostolica. Thankfully, it had been before curfew, but it was the only time he could remember Father Zosim actually being angry. He'd never gone that way again. "Yes, Alistair, you may be right that we are prisoners here, of a sort," Father Zosim said, after a pause, "but never forget that the mind is its own place. A prisoner may be freer, in his own way, than many that are free." By now, Alistair was quite familiar with the old monk's riddles. He could usually make neither head nor tail of them, but this was one of the rare occasions when he understood what he meant. He contemplated the bearded men and veiled women in the little paintings above the stove. One of them had arrows in his chest, and another was strapped to a wheel. Perhaps life in the reservation wasn't perfect, but their lives looked like they'd been much worse. "You mean that you're free here because you're allowed to believe what you want?" Alistair asked. "Yes, Alistair, for the old law was reserved to our community here," Father Zosim replied, "even if, in time, it was removed from every other province of the Imperium." "But it's not right," Alistair said distractedly. "I mean, they did all this to you, but they don't regret it, do they? They don't think about their sins, do they?" He looked at the oak door. The soldier might well be listening on the other side. On reflection, that was unlikely. She had no need. When Marians wanted to hear you, they used magic ears buried in walls. "They do, Alistair, only that they mean something different by that word to what we do," Father Zosim said. "So they don't have 7 sins like you do?" Alistair asked. "The Marians are concerned principally with one of them, young man," Father Zosim replied. "But, as I have told you many times before, you are too young to understand what it means." "In chastity?" Alistair asked. Of all the Latin words he'd failed to learn, it was one of the few he'd actually liked to have understood. It was also one of the few whose meaning Father Zosim refused to explain. "Yes," Father Zosim said, "chastity is the cardinal virtue which the Marians value above all else." "It means power, doesn't it?" Alistair blurted out. A few weeks earlier, he'd noticed a tattoo on one of the Marian legionnaires' arms, "Per castitatem ad potentiam," power through chastity. Ever since, he'd been waiting for an opportunity to ask what it meant. "Not quite, Alistair," Father Zosim replied. "Chastity means purity of body." "But that's not what they say, is it?" Alistair said. "They say chastity is power." "Yes, but what they mean is that earthly power devolves upon those who keep their bodies pure and free from sin," Father Zosim answered, "just as they believe the Virgin did when she descended from heaven to live among men." "And that's why they have magic, and we don't, isn't it?" Alistair said. "There is no such thing as magic, as I have told you many times before," Father Zosim replied, frowning. "There is only the grace of the Father." Well, techne, then," Alistair said breathlessly. "That's why they have glow buttons and hollow watchers and those ear stones they use to speak to one another in different tongues. And would you wish to have those things that the Marians do?" Father Zosim asked, almost guiltily. "I have always been sorry we do not have such things to give you as you would wish, Alistair." No, I didn't mean that, Father," Alistair said, blushing. "I only meant that I don't understand why they get all the power just because they say they're pure, and why they get to put that little light in the refectory that always goes red whenever you pray, as if you were doing something wrong, while they don't give you anything at all." "Render unto Caesar what is due to Caesar, Alistair," Father Zosim repeated. But why do they get to worry about just one sin, while you have to worry about all 7 of them?" Alistair said. "It isn't fair, All you do is live peacefully here and don't harm anyone, while they keep you here inside their big wall of fiery metal. Aren't they proud, angry, jealous, greedy, lazy, and gluttonous too?" One of Father Zosim's eyebrows rose again. "We reflect upon the 7 sins because it is our religion that we should," he said with a smile. "The Lord created us all differently, but by knowing our weaknesses, we may prevent them becoming our masters." Alistair fell silent. He was confused. He knew there were some things he was too young to understand, but even so it didn't seem fair. The more he thought about it, he couldn't think of a single time any of the friars had wronged anyone. Maybe he had done wrong in taking his neighbour's bread, but he wasn't really a friar. "So too, it is our religion that we listen to those who do not agree with us," Father Zosim added, just as Origen did with his accuser, Celsus, many centuries ago. He reached for the book. Alistair paled. "But he began in desperation, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. Without waiting for a reply, the visitor opened it. A glow stick shone in the dim corridor. "Wen it horror," the legionnaire said unsmilingly, her hand on her belt. "Time's up." "Very well," Father Zosim said, raising his eyes from the table. "It looks like we will have to return to the definition of religio next week." Alistair was already on his feet, only too glad to have escaped contra celsum for another week. Even so, he'd have liked to have stayed a little longer. He'd meant what he'd said about the sins. It seemed so unfair on the friars. But it wasn't just that. For perhaps the first time in a year, he'd felt closer to that answer he'd sought for so long. Why had he come to the reservation? "Haven't you forgotten something, young man?" Father Zosim asked. Alistair paused on the threshold. The Marian had him by the arm. "No, Father," Alistair said, turning back. "I'm quite sure I took everything I brought." He trailed off. Father Zosim had picked up the book from the desk. "Your reading for next week," Father Zosim said, handing him the tome with a smile. Alistair's heart fell.